world, non-black people of color are not at liberty to use the N-word in social discourse or in social commentary. While it is widely used in black communities, particularly young people with affiliation to hip-hop music, it's not used in political discourse. It's not used in civil discourse at all. So his justification for the use of the N-word in that setting was that he has been given a license, so to speak, to use it in the context of Africa, and that's simply not true, and it was misleading, and it created, I think, harmful perceptions that, the denigration of black people is permissible within spaces such as the African space, and that is not consistent with the reality and the facts. And I think that particular justification to me was even more troubling than the use of the word itself, because in the context in which he could have used it, I think that he could have made an excuse to say, listen, sorry, I didn't mean to say the full word, I should have said the N-word, and gotten on with the conversation. But to double down and tell students that he thinks he has the right to use it and to speak in contradiction to black voices trying to actually correct him on that issue, I think was something challenging for a person who's coming to lead an institution which is looking at Oriental and African studies.
Absolutely agree. Mapaseka, Adam Habib is described as a South African professor of political geography, director of the School of Oriental and African Studies. So if there's anyone who should have known the sensitivities around using the N-word when you're not a black person, it surely should be Professor Habib.
100%. I think it was particularly shocking, as well as him being the director of, the School of Oriental and African Studies where he is. So he should particularly understand the weight of hurt that comes with that word, and not to throw it around so easily. I think at the end of the day, we need to understand that this word is not one that can easily be licensed, okay? Even within people of color, not every single person of color can use that word. And even us as Africans, black people outside of the U.S., we take the directives and we are led by African Americans about how they want to use the word and in which context. So I think it was incredibly unbelievable that he would throw that word around. And then, another argument that he posed was the fact that, look, I actually come from a school of thought where this word can be used. What matters is context and intention, which is incredibly dangerous because you can't always tell. And also a non-black person can't decide and dictate how this word should be used. It's not even an argument. African Americans should decide how the word is used.
We've talked many a time about, Jaimie, about subliminal racism, if it were. Can we apportion that title to this act, the use of the N-word, by somebody who is all too familiar, certainly, with what apartheid has done in the past to South Africans?
Well, we could speak of unconscious bias if we were not speaking of somebody with a high body of knowledge in this particular space. Professor Adam Habib was at Wits during a critical period wherein social justice issues were being discussed on a daily basis. Further to that, this is his field of study. He has a lot of expertise on this, and he ought to have known that the conversation has moved on from what may have been the old school thoughts that maybe non-people of color may use this word. But like Mapaseka said, we have to take direction from the custodians of the original abuse. But number two, we have to pay attention to evolutions in thought. But even if I were to go further, I think one of the students, even in the event, critically pointed out that Walter Rodney, a PhD graduate from SOAS, was actually one person who outlined and created theory outlining that you cannot actually use this word as a non-black person of color. You don't have the lived experiences, you don't have the history, and as such, you cannot freely use the word. So I think that what we saw was a vice-chancellor who was not willing to be reflective, actually, about the call out that he was issued, because students tried to actually correct him in the moment, but he was unwilling to be reflective around the academic grounding for why he could not say this. So I think we can't just take it as an issue of being, unconscious bias when it comes to an individual who has a PhD in the political space.
Mapaseka, I'd like you to probably break it down for us a little bit more as soon as we've taken a look at that video. It's coming up now.
Not written in the chat. I said it's been used by lecturers. It's historically been ignored when students have raised it, and now you have just used it in a public meeting with students, and like many students are saying, and I find it myself unacceptable to have used that word in the meeting. Absolutely.
Well, you do, I don't actually. I come from a part of the world where we actually do use the word, and we say that it's unacceptable.
I'm sorry, but you're not a black man. You cannot use that word. That is not your lived experience. You do not face the trauma and the oppression of black bodies, what we go through 24/7 for the last 500 years. You do not embody our history. So therefore, you cannot use the word. Many writers, even our own alumni, such as Walter Rodney, have written as to why people, non-black POCs and white bodies should not use the N-word. Because when it comes from that perspective, then it means a whole different story from when it comes from our own perspective, which is the autonomy and the agency and the reclamation of our own history.
So can I, that's a lovely position. And I'm sorry I offended you. I come from a part of the world where when somebody uses it, I'm using it, the context matters.
Mapaseka, you're shaking your head. Context does not matter. You cannot use it, period. Would that be a fair opinion?
Look, I think for me, I'm shaking my head because of the arrogance of, the way that he's saying it. Like, I come from a particular world where this word is said, but that isn't true. And even though he falls within that umbrella of black consciousness, of Indian, colored, and Africans all being black, but still, do you know what I mean? That's not a word we can throw around like that. And even his experience as an Indian man, living in South Africa during apartheid, the level of discrimination wasn't the same. So for him to come out and sort of say, well, it's okay for me to actually use this word, that is not okay. I think we need to understand the fact that for any non-black person saying that word, there is this COVID racism. You can't really point it out why it makes us uncomfortable. People fail to articulate it, that you're saying it, you're not black, there's something wrong with it. And I think it could be because of the traumatic experience of white people in particular having said it to us, right, and our ancestors. So it's a reminder of that. So for anyone to throw it around in any context is definitely not okay. It's unacceptable. And as long as that is still the directive that's coming from African Americans, we need to respect that. There is no argument for us to even have to try and direct and say, nope. It matters in terms of context and intention, because you can't really point out that COVID racism of why would you even want to say a word like that? It's a distasteful, hurtful word to say.
Jaimie, we've obviously talked about the misfortune of the professor, the good professor, having said that. But it also took him a few days to publicly apologize. What do we read into that?
Well, I think we read into that he had to make an assessment about the value of staying silent. Initially, I think he was going to stay silent about this incident, but he was not aware that the incident had actually become public and had gotten a global footprint, because it was being consumed in the UK, also being consumed in South Africa and other parts of Africa. But also when you look at the Twitter explanation, it doesn't go far enough in actually giving a contrite apology to everybody who was offended. It was a if I offended type of situation where someone says, well, I don't view myself to have offended, but if if there's a condition that you did experience offense, then so be it. But I still maintain that I can use the word. I still maintain that I have license to use the word. And I think in that discourse, we don't have a progression and an understanding of why it is students and black bodies across Africa and across the world are saying, hang on, you can't actually use the word, and here's why. And even though we share oppression with other people of color, the intersectionality requires you to be cognizant of when you shouldn't take actions that step on the feet of other people who may share some struggle direction with you.
Mapaseka, subconscious racism is racism.
Absolutely, 100%. And in this day and age, that is not a defense. Do you know what I mean? Because there's so much information out there. We live in the information age, and it is up to us to educate ourselves. The past that we have for black people all around the world and the continued systematic racism, that is something that we should be educating ourselves on. It's something that, you know, our schools attempt to educate us on. So that isn't a defense as well. And I think we need to be cognizant. I remember there was a situation with an American actress, Gina Rodriguez, who was rapping to the word. And for the life of her, she couldn't understand why everyone was freaking out, because she is Latina, and according to her, her dad is particularly an Afro-Latina. So those are the sensitivities we need to be cognizant of, and we need to educate ourselves to understand that, you know what, and the experience of someone else is not particularly your experience. You might share certain things, but it doesn't mean that you now have the license to tap into that. I think another shocking experience would be with Cardi B. She uses the word all the time, which shocks me why people don't go crazy, but oh well. But it's our responsibility to educate ourselves at the end of the day.
Thank you very, very much for your time this morning. That was political analysts Jaimie, Mighti and Mapaseka Morua.